What's up, Sushi Squad? We back in with some more Trove, and today I thought we would do a video that I've already done in the past, but this time associated for this year. So I already have like the best classes to play of 2020. Let's talk about the best classes that you can play in 2021. Now, what we're going to be tackling with this video is I'm kind of going to give a brief summary of each of the classes, talk about their viability to the two main aspects of Trove, which is going to quite literally be doing U10 speed farming, or just dungeon farming in general as a whole, or the delves, because those are pretty much the two main focal points of all the classes in the entire game. Certain characters are better at dungeon farming than they are at delves, and vice versa. Now, the thing is, before we get started with today's video, I gotta let you guys know that you can pretty much play any character that you want, okay? Don't take any crap from nobody. Play the character that you enjoy playing, because that is the most important thing that you can end up doing with this game, is playing a character that you have fun playing. I mean, that's basically the whole goal of a video game in general, is to have fun with it. But you'd be surprised how many people get pressured into playing a character that they don't want to for the sake of it's more efficient, or this character's not the meta, or oh ho ho, this character's not strong enough. Nobody cares. Like, that's the thing, is for the majority of the game, none of that matters until you're at the absolute end. And even then, I mean, I'm at the end game. I've got 36k power rank on my strongest classes, and guess what? I still play the characters that I enjoy the most. And most recently, I'm actually enjoying the Bard, but that's because he's the newest character, which isn't out on consoles right now. But I'm still going to end up talking about the Bard and all the other characters as well, because it's only a matter of time before you guys end up getting him. Oh, and another thing I gotta let you guys know about is that if you are new to Trove, you can use that sign up link down in the description, and then anything you end up buying out of the cash shop, I make a percentage of that sale. It's an awesome way you can support my cost of living by just playing the game. Now, before we talk about all the classes, let's talk about how you're going to end up obtaining them real quick. The Sweet 16 pack basically is going to end up giving you every character except for the Bard, okay? The Bard is not included. And I know that for a lot of you, it's like, oh, but I don't want to spend the money. You can end up grinding all of the characters out yourselves, but trust me, a $20 pack that gets you all of the characters excluding the Bard is a pretty big deal, especially considering the fact that the Vanguard itself, if you buy the Vanguard with his standalone packs, it's going to cost you around like $30. So this is a really sweet deal, and I'm not trying to just push the cash shop. I just wanted to give you a quick summary of that. Now let's go in order of all of the characters. I'll have timestamps in the description, or YouTube chapters, so that you guys can skip to the character you want to see first. Also, just a heads up, if it wasn't obvious enough, today's video is not going to be focusing specifically on telling you how to build all of the characters, because otherwise we're going to be here all day, and I've already got videos that cover pretty much every single character at an individual level, so we can get into more detail. Today is quite specifically going to be talking about how you're going to use the character and their functionality in dungeons versus delves. So first we'll talk about the knight, and going forward, ignore the adventure worlds that I'm in. I'm just trying to give you guys examples and show you guys, like, you know, oh, here's the gameplay and stuff like that. But the knight is basically going to get brought down into, when you have your classroom ability, that is pretty much all you're going to be doing until Kingdom Come, just using your classroom ability, because all the other abilities on the knight are pretty useless. Not to say that you won't ever end up using them, but the knight, actually, lots of people rate the knight to be a very low tier character, but the knight's pretty darn good, dude, especially for dungeon farming. Even if the knight doesn't have the best in terms of speed farming dungeons and everything like that, one of the big things that I would argue is really good is once you get that classroom ability, this shot is going to go through multiple enemies, which is really good crowd control and good for fighting groups of mobs and being able to clear dungeons themselves quite speedy, because as you're just going through a dungeon and stuff, you know, a boss might end up having like a whole bunch of enemies around him or what have you, and so you could just end up shooting through them and killing everything all in one shot. Now, with that said, that means that the knight can be kind of useful in the delves, not super duper useful, but most of all, like at the earlier portions, just because of the fact that there's so many enemies in the delves, your classroom ability will end up being very useful for that. That said, where would I end up putting the knight in terms of both delves and just speed farming or dungeon farming? Probably in the dungeon farming, and he's definitely not going to end up being top tier, but he most certainly is viable, and that's kind of the big point point that I want to get across today, just because lots of people, again, give a lot of slack to the Knight and put him very, very low on their tier list when the Knight already had its rework years ago and is actually quite powerful. For my money, though, the only thing that I don't like about the Knight is because you're just spamming your number 1 ability and just seeing this animation over and over, it's not really the funnest class to play, and you don't really have super amazing movement speed or anything like that. Not to mention, you can't end up using the Knight subclass ability because you're on the Knight, so you can't end up getting movement speed on your mount, which would definitely have helped him get to a higher tier in terms of speed farming. Pirate Captain. How's the Pirate Captain going to fare for you? Well, he's probably not going to be your first option when it comes to just normal dungeon grinding. The thing about the Pirate Captain is a lot of people don't understand how powerful this character can actually be. However, he's extremely powerful under very specific situations, which is kind of one of the things that a lot of people, myself included, would argue is what makes the character a little bit on the boring side. But, you know, again, it's not about my judgments towards the character. I'm just trying to show you guys good examples of them so that you can judge for yourselves. But the thing is that the Pirate Captain can do omega damage if you end up throwing down your ult and other abilities and stuff like that, and then you end up having cooldown emblem, cooldown out, that's a bad example, but a cooldown ally, cooldown emblem and stuff, because you can actually get your cooldown like down quick enough that you can have multiple cannons of your ultimate ability down on the ground. And that's where the Pirate Captain can do like some serious damage, dude. In which case, it would end up being very, very good against delve bosses. But I wouldn't necessarily say that the Pirate Captain is super duper good at speed farming, just because we've still got the movement speed issue to deal with. However, we can use a Knight subclass ability. So if you have a powerful enough Knight, pretty much every 5,000 power rank that you have on your Knight is going to end up giving you 5 more movement speed to the Knight subclass ability. So I can get to 125. If I had my Knight at 35 KPR, I would have 130 movement speed while on a mount, which, you know, it's not awful. It's definitely manageable. The Pirate Captain does have the damage to do dungeons, like that's kind of the thing as well, but you're gonna be very reliant on your main attack abilities because your turrets aren't really as useful as you would think. Like, they're gonna end up doing damage, to be sure, but the problem is that the turrets pretty much have a mind of their own, so they're going to end up targeting whatever they feel like, and that is where the character kind of falls flat. It's just because of the fact that you can't pick your targets, because a lot of the end game dungeons, let's say like 5-star dungeons or even the delves, are going to have a lot of enemies around, and maybe you want to target a specific enemy to complete a dungeon faster, or maybe you don't want to target certain enemies within the delves because you're trying to end up doing something else, like a different objective or what have you, right? And that's where Pirate Captain kind of falls a little bit flat in that regard. That said, Pirate Captain has pretty good damage against a single target, because obviously all of your turrets will just target the one opponent, and it doesn't mean that the character is not viable for end game just because the damage does scale pretty well. But one of the big now I can talk about one of the big key factors that we'll get into with the other characters a little bit later in the game is the build up time. So build up time to a character is basically what I call it, and it basically is, okay, how much time does it take before this particular class can end up doing their maximum output of damage? And the Pirate Captain is very, very slow at that, just because of the fact that, like I said, you got to basically pop down your ult and then you got to spam flash so that you can throw down another one and throw down your other turrets and wait for your cooldown and get your class gem. And not only that, but you're shooting enemies to build up doubloons so that you can do more, and it just basically takes a little longer than I would hope it would compared to other characters. So now moving on to the Ice Sage. The funny thing is that the old school Ice Sage was better for speed farming, but since the rework, the Ice Sage is actually just outright better for delves and leviathans and bosses and stuff like that. I can't really recommend that you use the Ice Sage for normal dungeon farming. You're gonna end up being powerful and being able to pretty much absolutely obliterate dungeons, that's for sure. Like, I could definitely end up using my Ice Sage in U10 and it would be just as quick as other characters at killing, but maybe not necessarily the movement, because the movement abilities of the Ice Sage have been nerfed considerably over time, just because they kind of moved towards damage. And that's the thing, is that technically is better, right? Because lots of people always recommend Ice Sage as one of the top tiered characters in the game right now in terms of doing delves and leviathans. Delves in particular, the the Ice Sage just destroys in there. So you can definitely end up using the Ice Sage for sure top 5, if not even top 3 in terms of a Delve character. But for speed farming, you're pretty much going to be stuck using a Knight subclass ability and using the, you know, mount movement speed and stuff like that as per usual, right? I don't really have that much else to say about the character other than you're pretty much going to be using all of your abilities, most of all your ultimate ability, which is going to give you the sweet 300%, well, more than 300%. You saw it was 1,000% attack damage or attack speed. Attack speed, it has a natural limit of 300% though, so anything over that doesn't really do anything. It just looks cool. But yeah, you can definitely end up using the Ice Sage for whatever you want because it's definitely a powerful, strong enough character. However, if I had to say between doing it in, you know, speed farming and stuff like that versus Delves, you're probably just going to want to use this character for Delves or Leviathans or just as a boss killer, right? Now, Shadowhunter, I mean, I could go on and on about Shadowhunter. You guys know this is one of my all-time favorite characters in the game, okay? But if we're being perfectly honest, Shadowhunter is in desperate need of a rework. Not necessarily because it can't compete with Endgame in terms of its playability. The playability of the character is perfectly fine. The problem is that the damage numbers just fall off compared to other characters in the game. And it's really, really disappointing. Now, obviously, once you end up getting the class gem ability for the Shadowhunter, you're basically just using your minigun shot. And it's a lot of fun and can end up destroying enemies if you end up popping a flask and using Martial Emblem and stuff. But the point is that you're still going to have to use Martial Emblem even when you get to the end game so that your damage can end up competing with other people that are at the end game, because one of the big problems with his machine gun Gatling gun shot is that it doesn't phase through enemies, meaning that if there's a horde of enemies and the boss is all the way at the back, you're going to have to systematically kill every single enemy that's in the way before you end up hitting the boss. And even then, ranged attacks in this game are very, very buggy at the best, we could say. They're buggy, you know, sometimes they just outright don't work. But the point is that with the Shadowhunter having a constant stream of shots, it generally seems to be the most buggy of all. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's just me running into lots of ping issues with this guy. But generally speaking, though, is it a fun class? Yes, most definitely. Are you going to turn any heads when it comes to doing speed farming or the Delves? Heck no. For speed farming, yeah, you can use the Shadowhunter. It's not like you can't main it or anything. But in terms of Delves, no. Just don't do it. Unfortunately, just don't. One of the things that I always say to everybody, and that is one of the most disappointing things about the Shadowhunter, is because it's a physical-based character, you could literally take all of your gems and all of your gear from the Shadowhunter, throw it onto the Neon Ninja, and the Neon Ninja is going to be faster and deal more damage than the Shadowhunter would. It's just unfair and it sucks. Especially when you're probably asking, well, what about the ult? The ult half the time doesn't work. That's the problem with the ult. It has too long a cooldown and it doesn't work half the time. If it worked all the time and had a little bit less of a cooldown so that I could end up using my Shadowhunter ult almost every dungeon, then that would be great, because it can end up one-shotting and does some of the highest damage in the entire game. It's just you can't consistently use it well enough to end up making it viable for Leviathans or Delves or anything like that, because Delves just requires that much more damage. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about endgame Delves and endgame speed farming, but yeah, you can main the character most definitely because it's fun, but not because you want to be a top tier class. The Fae Trickster, on the other hand, is a character that lots of people always talk about how good it is, and personally speaking, I don't like this character. Like, it's probably my least favorite class in the game. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. It's just not one of my favorites. I don't know. There's just something about the character that I just inherently feel is very, very lame. That said, it's got some of the best video effects. Like, look at that glitter bomb. It's beautiful. The ultimate ability basically does like 3 times your damage or something ridiculous. And then, you know, teleport around to get enemies to be lured by those things, which ends up giving you a lot of survivability, because the enemies are going to be busy with your shadow clones, right? Now, that said, Fae Trickster can have some of the highest single target damage in the game. Not the highest, but it can end up being pretty powerful, and that's why a lot of people rate the Fae Trickster so high up in their tier list. It's just because the damage can compete with some of the top classes in the game. But that said, I still rarely end up seeing anybody actually main the Fae Trickster. And I'm not saying anything against those of you that think this is the coolest class in the game or anything. I'm just saying that as much as people always talk about the Fae Trickster being like, oh, it's one of the top tier classes at the end game, then how come I never see anybody at the end game using the Fae Trickster? Everyone's always just using like Ice Sage or Chloromancer or something, especially because similar to how I said with the Shadow Hunter, you could literally swap the gems to Neon Ninja and just be outright better. Fae Trickster, you could swap all your gear and gems to Ice Sage or Chloromancer, and you will more than likely just out damage the class and be a lot better. That said, one of the reasons that you might want to end up maining the Fae Trickster is because the movement abilities aren't bad. You know, it's got a good roll, and the right-click teleport can end up being really useful if you end up having enough energy regen that you can end up speeding through dungeons and stuff. I don't know why I just had a big frame dip there, but oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Now we're going to be talking about the Candy Barb, and I got to tell you guys, I'm just going to say it outright. This character is amazing at the beginning of the game to the mid-tier, but as soon as you get to the end game, it sucks. You're pretty much only going to be used for the utility of the character, of being able to pull enemies in, or your ultimate ability, you know, being able to give everybody super duper attack speed. You're pretty much going to be using the Barb at the end game to complement other people that are going to just outright out damage you and stuff like that. That said, you can definitely main the Candy Barb, and it is one of the funnest melee characters in the game, I would argue, especially at the early game. Like, it's a lot of fun. He's really powerful too with how he scales at the beginning of the game. Obviously, that kind of gets lower and lower scaling when you get closer to the end. But generally, if I had to say between doing speed farming and doing delves, Barb is okay. You know, he's going to end up not being super duper fast when it comes to dungeon grinding, unless, here's the thing. If you get his classroom ability, it's going to be really good for the utility of pulling enemies in, but you no longer leap forward. The leap forward can be invaluable if you're actually trying to do a speed farm build, because you could just be hopping forward like crazy, and it covers a lot more distance than you would think. So if you're actually just going for speed farming on the Candy Barb, then you don't want to end up getting your classroom ability. You're still not going to be super duper fast or anything, but it's ungodly fun. Like, especially the leap forward is just such a fun ability to end up using. And again, you know, your ult is going to slap like a truck, but most of all, when it comes to delves or leviathans or whatever, you're pretty much there just to help other people. And even then, you got to be good enough at helping other people that they want you in the group, because otherwise you could just literally be replaced by somebody that does deal a large amount of damage. In which case, why wouldn't they just take that over the Barb? Neon Ninja is the fastest class in the game. Bang bang, cowboy, I'm the Gunslinger. Okay, I'm kidding. I'll do a little bit more of an explanation of the Neon Ninja. But yes, Neon Ninja is pretty much the fastest class. Not necessarily just in terms of its movement speed or anything, but basically when you end up doing your right-click backflip, you get movement speed buff while you're invisible. But on top of that, if you turn your camera backwards, and it's going to be really tough to do this on console, just because you're with a controller. I mean, those of you that can do it, good job. You basically just spam your backflip. And yeah, that's how you end up going super duper fast. I'm doing a very bad example right now because I don't have all of my best gear on the Neon Ninja, like all my movement speed gear or pyro disc, what have you. But the fact of the matter is that Neon Ninja can end up having an ungodly amount of movement speed. I'd recommend that for your ring, you probably want to have one that has energy regen, just because if you have energy regen on even any of your pieces of equipment, it's basically going to make it so that while you're on the ground, you'll regenerate your energy fast enough that you can basically just spam backflip. Because if you're in the air, obviously your energy isn't regenning until you end up touching the ground for a certain amount of time. That said, a lot of the end game with Neon Ninja is jumping through the air and backflipping from dungeon to dungeon, especially just because of how speedy you're going to be. However, the one thing that I don't personally like about the Neon Ninja in terms of the speed farming method is just the fact that you pretty much gotta be playing the whole game backwards, and you don't really get to see any of the cool things, and you gotta focus a lot just because of how speedy he's going. It's like you're speed running all the time, right? And so you get into this mindset of trying to be the most efficient possible, which can end up being a lot of fun if you're into that whole stress meets fun / gameplay thing. But for me personally, not my absolute favorite in terms of end game grinding. Now the thing is, as I mentioned previously with a pirate captain, the amount of uptime that it takes takes before you end up doing the maximum amount of damage can end up being overshadowed by certain other characters. And the Neon Ninja is going to compensate by being able to travel long distances over a very short period of time. But the problem is that the Neon Ninja Shuriken takes a little bit longer than some other characters will to end up defeating a boss. Like Vanguard, for example, just goes in, bop, bop, bop with his right-click laser. The boss is already dead and the Vanguard is moving on, while the Neon Ninja is still building up his stacks. Just to give you guys an example. That said, Neon Ninja is a speed farmer. You are going to be right at home when you're doing dungeons and stuff like that, and I would still argue it is pretty much top 3 for sure, if not still the #1 for the speediest character in the game. There are other characters that are quite speedy that I enjoy more. I guess I'll point that out, okay? Now, as far as just doing delves and stuff like that, nah. You're not going to use Neon Ninja on Leviathans. Everyone's going to tell you to get out. And if you are doing delves, your basic goal is to get to the end of the entire delve so that everybody can get warped to the end once the objective is done. But you're not going to do anything. Even when you're fighting the boss, the Neon Ninja, though it has a lot of damage in the open world, is just not going to be strong enough when it comes to delves. Bang, bang, cowboy, I'm the Gunslinger. Okay, I'll never do that again. Gunslinger is still top tier in terms of damage, definitely top 5. Personally speaking, if I could criticize this character, I'd say it's not a lot of fun, and I'd say that Ice Sage and most definitely Chloromancer end up giving Gunslinger a run for their money, because Gunslinger, though really, really powerful, is entirely dependent on your ultimate ability. So what you're going to be doing in terms of just fighting groups of enemies and stuff is you pop your ult, and then you're going to end up using cooldown flasks and so on and so forth, so that you can basically keep your ult at a continuous rate, you know. And as I ended up mentioning with the Candy Barb and how his ultimate ability ends up giving you attack speed, well, that can work hand in hand with the Gunslinger, because it's going to end up making it so that you shoot a lot faster, and so your ultimate ability is just going to screen clear, destroy everything, right? It's those with photosensitivity don't use the Gunslinger, okay? Because it's going to be doing this in your face at all times. Now, that said, Gunslinger for dungeon farming? I mean, you can, but it's not going to end up being a very good character for it. There's definitely a lot of other characters that are higher tier in terms of speed farming is concerned, especially because movement speed is an afterthought on the Gunslinger, so you're pretty much stuck to using the Knight subclass ability and mount movement speed once again. In terms of just defeating dungeon bosses, I mean, you're going to be okay. Obviously, your ranged attacks are going to end up hitting enemies from further away than melee characters, and, you know, your abilities on the Gunslinger can end up being a lot of fun, just because you can end up one-shotting some dungeon bosses and stuff like that. But generally speaking, you're not going to be using this guy for speed farming. I mean, it's entirely up to you if you want to, but I'd recommend you use it for either the Delves or Leviathans. And then even then, you've got a lot of other options where, once again, if you take all your gems off of the Gunslinger, put it on the Ice Sage, put it on the Chloromancer, you're just going to be better. Put your gems on the Dino Tamer, and you're going to be a much faster magic damage character, or even the Bard. But we'll get into those a little bit later in the video. As far as just the gameplay is concerned, I mean, you know, you got the levitation and everything, which is nice, but the entirety of this kit is just based off of the ultimate ability. The Draco. This is actually another one of my favorite characters. I remember maining this character back when U6 was the highest difficulty, and Draco was the strongest character in the game back then. Ended up becoming kind of low tier, and then ended up getting his rework like a couple years back, and ultimately ended up becoming really, really viable for the end game. Draco is one of those characters where you have a lot of it takes a lot of uptime before you end up getting your full damage capacity, because basically with your class gem, your bombs are going to end up summoning these babies, and you can have 6 of them out at a time. So the entirety of what you're going to be doing is just throwing down bombs, holding your #1 and main attacks and everything like that, basically using your ult on cooldown, and then that's going to end up doing some really, really high tier damage. Like, Draco can end up being insanely powerful, but of course you still have to slowly build up all of your units, which means that you're not going to end up being super duper viable when it comes to speed farming dungeons and stuff like that. However, if you're going into, like, let's say you're in an elemental lava world or something like that, then Draco can actually end up being, well, probably one of the top speed farmers in the game. Because the thing is with this guy, which is a really, really weird passive ability. If you end up touching lava, you get a movement speed buff, right? So if you have that with a bunch of movement speed gear and everything like that, you can actually be really, really fast. And Draco's got high enough damage that you'll be able to defeat most dungeon bosses without even breaking a sweat. That said, where I would say the Draco shines is in the Delves, because Draco has insane amounts of survivability and damage. That's kind of the thing about this character, because enemies are going to be aggroed towards your little babies, which means that they're not going to be damaging you as much, which gives you a lot more survivability, right? Because you're basically trying to keep the enemies busy with your babies, and then you're on the back side of the enemy damaging them continuously, which, I mean, on top of the fact that they're going to end up being super distracted, Draco just naturally is really tanky. Like, I would say if there was an armor stat in the game, Draco probably has the highest defense, especially if you are like dying a lot and you end up using like a life-stealing ally or something. When you pop your ult, you just become a super duper tanky boss, and barely anything can end up touching you. Generally speaking though, I love the Draco. I wouldn't use it for speed farming. I would use it most of all for Delves. You can end up using it for Leviathan, but again, other characters are just going to outshine it. That said, yeah, you can definitely end up using Draco for top tier end game like damage and survivability. Like, I was able to solo a lot of deep Delves with this character. Boomeranger sucks. I'm sorry, guys. Really, this character is just absolutely terrible. I don't like. Okay, let me be clear before you dislike the video and move on. I love Boomeranger as a character. I feel like its abilities are a lot of fun. The movement is some of the funnest in the entire game. But the thing about the Boomeranger is that it needs a rework really, really bad. Like, it's probably one of the most useless classes because of many things. One, your damage just sucks, your survivability is terrible, and one of the worst things about the character is that your ultimate and stuff like that are going to end up having mega amounts of knockback. This is going to be a bad example, but the point is, if you're fighting a dungeon boss and it's on top of a cliff or on top of a dungeon even, you can end up using one of your abilities and it could potentially end up knocking that enemy you know, completely off of the dungeon, which makes it really, really annoying to play. Now, the two options with this character is you can end up using a sword or you can end up using a bow, which is interesting as a whole. But generally you're only really using the bow to give yourself more survivability, because otherwise the melee is definitely a lot better. But again, your damage is just not going to end up being any good, because the whole thing is with this being a full physical character. Let's say you have a sword or even a bow, you could take all of your gear and swap it to either Shadow Hunter or Neon Ninja, and you will just instantly become way more viable. It's very disappointing because this character is a lot of fun, can end up having some pretty good movement speed, and I love the role. It's probably one of my favorite roles in the entire game, just because of how far you end up traveling with it. And just generally speaking, like I said, the class is a lot of fun, in which case, if that's why you want to main it, go for it. But in terms of just speed farming, other characters obviously do a better job, and Delves, you're pretty much useless. I mean, Boomeranger was useless even back when Shadow Tower was like a main focal point of the game. Oh, good God. Okay, yeah, so last time I was on Toomraiser, this was the costume that was added. Okay, Toomraiser is top tier. Pretty much he's a stronger version of the Draco. Toomraiser ended up getting his rework, I think, like last year, if I'm not mistaken. And oh my God, he's a powerful character. Not only that, he's a lot of fun. Like, I personally love this guy. He's got the high tier damage, so you can end up using him for speed farming if you want. However, you're not going to have that much movement speed, so once again, you're entirely dependent on the Knight subclass ability. But in terms of just defeating dungeon bosses, I mean, they're easy to this guy. It's an absolute joke. You can even just go into a dungeon, just do a right click with all your babies right here, and they will mop the floor with anything that is there. The other thing too is in terms of Leviathans, you can end up doing a hefty amount of damage as well. Unfortunately, you are going to have to get up close and personal with the Toomraiser because it's not really ranged character or anything like that. But Delves, most definitely you can end up using Toomraiser. Now, the thing about this character, though, is that the uptime, the amount of time that it takes for you to end up doing your maximum amount of damage is really, really slow, because each of your little babies is going to spawn, as you can see, with their little own health bar. And then any additional babies on top of the initial, like, you can summon 6 babies total. And any of them that you end up having on top of those will basically just give them a purple health bar, right? So the purple health bar means that he's going to end up being a stronger version of the little summoned ally. But on top of that, your ultimate ability is going to single-handedly have its strength based off of how much purple health bar minions you have out at the time. So the more of them that you have out at any given time is going to end up making it so that your ultimate ability is going to literally steal their power. So the absolute maximum amount of damage that you can end up doing with Tomb Raiser is having 6 of your minions all with purple health, summoning your ult so he's in big chungus mode, and then getting your minions to end up having all of their purple health bar again. As far as speed farming is concerned, you're going to kill dungeons fast, but generally speaking, you're not going to be very quick. Delves, yes, most definitely. Top tier, top 3, I would argue, just because the survivability on top of the damage is really, really viable. And you can end up using Tomb Raiser on Leviathans. It's just going to be really tough if you're fighting U10 Leviathans with a group, because U10 Leviathan has an ability that can one-shot you if you're in melee range. The Revenant. What do I say about the Revenant? Revenant's a character that a lot of people feel is really cool, and you can definitely end up maining it, but generally speaking, if you may have noticed the theme throughout this entire video, a lot of the melee characters become pretty useless when it comes to like high tier delves and stuff like that. Revenant's one of those weirdo characters where you're not going to end up being very good for speed farming just because the slowness of the class. Obviously, you're going to be using the Knight subclass ability. Once again, this is a terrible example because this ally has no movement speed, or mount has no movement speed. But then when you go to dungeons and stuff, you can use your shield bash to effectively beat a lot of dungeon bosses, but generally the highest damage you can do on this guy is having your number 1 and your main attack going off at the exact same time. It is going to drain your health, which obviously is not very good. Your ultimate ability is literally just used to pull enemies in, because it's not going to do anything other than that. They changed the ultimate on this costume. Yeah, they did. Normally it wasn't jewel encrusted, at least as far as I remember. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But anyways, can you end up using the character for speed farming? Not really. Can you use it for delves? Yeah, it's got a high enough amount of damage threshold, that's for sure. And it kind of goes from 0 to 50 almost immediately, but just toggling on your number 1 and doing your main attacks, right? But generally, I would argue that this character is either, like, the thing about the Revenant is that it can either be damage or a tank. It's probably one of the only other characters that you can actually give like millions upon millions of health to give a lot of survivability. That said, obviously, you know, Draco and Tomb Raiser are going to end up out surviving it at a much lower health bar, because they can end up just dealing the damage while also having, you know, just high survivability. Whereas Revenant, you gotta build the character towards being a tank. However, the character does have a lot of life leech, and that's kind of what ends up making it very, very good survivability. So long as you end up having enough health that you don't get one shot by an enemy, usually you can self-regen yourself out of fatal damage. Lunar Lancer is another one of those characters that's pretty bad, unfortunately. Lots and lots of fun, kind of the same as the Boomeranger in terms of, oh, it's a lot of fun, but it's not very viable. Lots of people would argue that you can definitely end up using the Lunar Lancer, whereas the Boomeranger is just kind of useless. Lancer is not bad. The problem with Lancer is that literally all of your damage is your number 1 ability, so you are single-handedly stuck to this amount of attack speed and this amount of damage output. Now, apparently the Lunar Lancer might be the next character that ends up getting a rework, so we can obviously talk about that when the character ends up actually getting the rework. But generally speaking, the biggest thing about this character is that most of your abilities are useless, save for the fact that you're using your number 1 for all of your damage. Your grappling hook, though a lot of fun, doesn't really have that much utility outside of, I don't know, just parkour. Your ultimate ability doesn't really do that much, but I mean, it's always good to end up popping it off while you're using your number 1 ability. The big thing about the Lancer and why a lot of people still use this character is because even though you have a lot of damage fall off just because of the limitations of the class, you have some of the highest natural movement speed on a class in the game, which means that you can end up having, you know, Pyro Disc, a movement speed ally, and all that stuff. You can be a pretty good speed farmer if you have full movement speed gear, because you are going to end up having higher movement speed than just using a Knight subclass ability, which is pretty darn good. So speed farming is perfectly fine, but when it comes to doing delves and doing high tier damage on Leviathans and stuff, nah, you just don't use Lunar Lancer. Nobody uses Lunar Lancer in the delves and stuff, which is unfortunate, and hopefully we see Lunar Lancer come back to form with a rework sometime soon. Now, Chloromancer, oh my god. Okay, Chloromancer ended up very, very recently getting a rework before they ended up adding the Bard to the game. And the Chloromancer rework, as far as I know, is available on the Nintendo Switch version of the game, but not available on Xbox and PS4 right now. So we'll see how long that takes to end up getting ported over. But my god, this is probably top 3, if not, I would argue it's probably the top damage in the entire game right now. Just because Chloromancer scales so insanely well in terms of damage. Now, for speed farming, I mean, you can, again, use the character at the end game dungeons just because you're going to kill bosses quick enough. But in terms of the travel time between dungeons, you're pretty much reliant on a Knight subclass ability, again, which means that you're not going to end up being a super duper speedy character. That said, everything about this character was completely reworked from years ago, where you're basically just using your plants all the time, and your ultimate ability is going to make it so that you throw down bigger versions of these plants that deal ultra mega damage. And you can definitely use this character not only in delves, but also for Leviathans. Unlike the Dino Tamer. Dino Tamer is an insanely speedy class in the game, especially for a magic damage character, and we're starting to get near the end here, but if you took all your gems off Chloromancer and threw them onto Dino Tamer, you would be a speedy boy. Basically, the whole goal of this class is to keep your ultimate up at all times, so you're using the cooldown allies and emblems and junk like that, so that you can keep your cooldown, so that the moment you end up coming out of your ultimate ability, you can end up casting it again, because you're going to have a lot of movement speed. Obviously, I don't have all of my gear on this character, so I can't show you guys how speedy this character can be right now, but generally speaking, that's going to be what it's all about, is using your ult and using your net, because your net is going to be some really high damage, actually, especially because not only is it going to snare enemies, but any enemies in this radius are basically just going to get melted, because it's like a microwave net. Like, it just melts them right in your face, right? And when you're in your ultimate ability, you're always throwing down the best net possible, and you don't have any energy regen to deal with because the character doesn't have any energy, so you can usually just stay up in the air dancing around and giving yourself a lot of survivability. Like, even way back in the day, Dino Tamer was really, really good for Shadow Towers, just because of the fact that you could stay up in the air, which gives you a lot of survivability. And so you can end up using Dino Tamer in delves because of that, because you will be able to survive, and you do have a decent enough amount of damage, that's for sure, and you can definitely end up speed farming as well. So Dino Tamer is kind of one of the rare cards where it's in the middle. You can use it for either or. Now, you're not going to end up being top tier when it comes to delves, or even Leviathans is just kind of out of the question. But speed farming, you are top 5 for sure, and in terms of delves, you don't have to swap off the character if you don't want to. Now we can finally talk about the Vanguard, and let me tell you, this character is top tier, okay? Maybe not in terms of super duper mega damage or anything like that. I'm gonna tell you guys outright, you're not gonna be using the Vanguard in the delves like at all, because this character kind of sucks when it comes to the delves. But in terms of speed farming, not as fast as Neo Ninja, kills bosses quicker than Neo Ninja, and I would argue is funner than Neo Ninja, because you can face forward and still end up having all of your movement speed. You're pretty much going to be exclusively in melee mode. There's not really any reason to use ranged outside of, I don't know, messing around and having fun. But generally, your number 1 ability gives you some movement speed on top of tagging enemies with a movement speed ally and pyro disc and all of that stuff. That's going to be your bread and butter to having your high amounts of movement speed. You don't need to use a Knight subclass ability. You can if you want, but you don't have to, just because of the fact that this character is going to be Speedy Gonzalez. Now, the thing is that in terms of damage, right click. Your laser is your friend, because you can just and spend all of your energy, but by the time your energy is at 0, more than likely whatever you were shooting at is already dead. So really, really good for speed farming. Terrible in delves, and don't even bother trying to use it on Leviathans, because you are kind of just wasting everyone's time. And last but not least, the character that is not currently on consoles right now, the Bard, which is probably one of my favorite characters in the game right now, just because we not only have our first ever meme character, just because, I mean, literally this guy is playing a lute. Like, what an idiot. I love him. But on top of that, he's extremely viable and very versatile. You can actually end up using the Bard very effectively in delves, kind of use it on Leviathans. It's kind of another one like Dino Tamer, where it's a jack of all trades. You can use it in Delves, you can use it on Leviathans, you most definitely can use it for speed farming. I would argue that the Bard is... he's either on par with Dino Tamer, if not faster, just because his speed is more consistent. Because with Dino Tamer, you're reliant on your ult so much, which if you can't get that timing right, obviously you're going to be dealing with that and constantly using flasks and stuff. Whereas with the Bard, I mean, you pretty much just tag constant enemies, and then all you got to really do is use your ult like twice to end up having the high movement speed buff that you end up getting. And that buff is going to last a significant amount of time. As you can see in the top left, this little green thing right here, we basically have the movement speed buff for 30 seconds. So even though my ultimate ability isn't visually around me anymore, we still have kept the buff that we ended up getting from the ultimate ability, and we can just as easily apply it at any point in time. Now, this character is really weird though, because the amount of uptime that you have to have, you know, in order to do the maximum damage that the Bard can actually output, you're going to have to slowly complete the actions that are shown here while your ultimate timer is slowly cooling down, so that you ultimately end up getting to this stack right here, which is the 7th stack, the 7th cube, let's call it. And when you get to that point, then the Bard is doing maximum damage output. And then it's actually really, really easy to just keep that. That's kind of the big difference between this character and others. Like someone like the Tomb Raider, where it takes such a long time to end up getting to the point where you're dealing maximum amount of damage. You're basically on a time limit dealing that damage before your babies end up dying or your ultimate ends up dying, and then you got to kind of repeat the whole process, right? Bard, on the other hand, you can pretty much just keep the stacks so long as you just keep doing the action that's mentioned in the middle of the screen, which is where the character can become really overly stimulating when you're playing it and stuff like that. And I kind of wanted to go into a little bit more detail with the character, just because I know those of you on console don't have this character, but it's only a matter of time. So when it comes out, then you can actually know what to do with it. And that's about gonna do it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for watching. Obviously, this video took me a little bit longer than you would think to end up doing. You know, it took me about an hour's worth of recording that I have to cut down and edit for you guys and everything, but it's gonna be worth it. Can be worth it. And if you thought it was worthwhile, please be sure to smash like, sub for more if you haven't already, because obviously I cover pretty much everything there is to do with Trove. Got lots of our tutorials planned for sure, on top of just, you know, playing the game here and there on the Switch and whatever. And I still want to do some live streams sometime soon as well, because it's been a while since I ended up chilling with you guys live playing Trove. Either way, I hope you all have a fantastic day. Buy the merch you want to support the channel. Sign on and stay epic, gamers.